Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Welcome this evening. Thank you very much for coming, joining us at the launch, the second launch of this book. We launched it in California a few months ago without any copies of the book. Today, mashallah, we have lots of copies, and there are a lot of you. So thank you very much for coming. I'm going to talk about a number of things today. I wish I had a couple of hours. I really do. I mean, I'm crazy about this book. It's one of those things that it comes along in your life and animates you or reanimates you. You know, it made me feel young again, let's say. I'm going to talk about it from the translator's perspective. I'll talk about the book itself, why I chose the book for translation. I'll talk about the narrator of the book, because the book is narrated. It's quite interesting in that respect. I'll talk about the title of the book, and then I'll talk a little bit about the text. And we'll probably run out of time before I'm halfway through any of that. But we'll do our best here. So let me begin at the beginning. At the very beginning, I have the dedication. I've dedicated this to Aishi, my wife, and to the clans Zahid and Qadir, her maternal and paternal family, people to whom I owe a great debt of gratitude for being, you know, who they are. Very wonderful people indeed. And at the end of the introduction of the book, total dedication to my wife again. And finally, I say, without her support and encouragement, this work would never have been possible. And without her, I would indeed be destitute. So thank you. See, that's that total dedication. If you're going to be dedicated, you got to do it all the way. Okay, wa shukr wal imtinan. I have to thank the publisher, mashallah, Yahya, who in his own way has managed to do some incredible things. He's the owner of the Huma Press, which took up this project to my surprise. You know, he's been after me for other translations and other work, and I wish I could do all of it for him. But I came to him one day and said, by the way, I've got this wonderful book, you really ought to consider it. And it was kind of out of his ballpark, you know, so but he, nonetheless, mashallah, he took it up. And thanks to Mufti Abdurrahman for his kind words this morning, but also for helping with the typesetting of the book. I could, I suppose, talk about translation as an art, but we don't have enough time. So just take it on trust. Translation is an art. About the book itself. The important thing about this book is that it's about, you have to understand the context a little bit, even though it's a book about universal truths. It's important to understand the context. World War I came along. Egypt was effectively a colony of the British, our good British friends here. And the British, for their war effort, needed food for their troops and uniforms and tents and all of that stuff. So they needed all of Egypt's cotton, and they needed all of Egypt's food, beef and whatever they could produce. With the result that the average man and woman in the street, people like you and me, went hungry and barely had enough clothes to wear, despite the fact that there are some pretty severe winters there. And so they went through a very, very difficult period. The author of this book, Mustafa Sadiq al-Rafi'i, was a clerk in the courts, in the Sharia courts. It was a family sort of tradition. There were, in the Rafi'i family, there were nearly 40 qadis, judges in the Sharia courts. It was a family occupation. He was a clerk, and he came in contact daily with the masses most of whom were starving and miserable during that period. And so something started to churn in his head. He was naturally a poet. He published his first volume of poetry at the age of 19 or 20 and was immediately recognized by the firmament of literature in Egypt at the time. Even the Shaykh al-Azhar Rashid Rada commented and congratulated him, and so many others, Hafiz Ibrahim and all of these amazing people from that period. So he was, but at the same time, he was this adib, he was a poet, but at the same time, he was a deeply compassionate man and one who understood instinctively the human condition. And so he wrote this book in pieces. How can you classify this book? Well, I think probably the best way to characterize it is to say it's a work of creative nonfiction. Very creative. But the nonfiction part is kind of hard to get into because it's very much about reality and the sad realities of life in poverty. We could have a whole discussion here about the subject of al-adab al-rafi'. Again, if I had a couple of hours, I would love to jump into this subject. It's a debate nowadays in the Arab world. Those of you who are a part of it, you'll understand that al-adab al-rafi' maybe the best mithal of al-adab al-rafi' is al-rafi'i. About the book. The author himself explains in his preface and then in his introduction a little bit about, his motivation for writing. He said that he wrote the book about poverty not for the purpose of eradicating it, but so that it may be endured patiently. And he doesn't attempt to study it, not to study it, but in order to console those it has afflicted. This is a book of contemplations, and it requires, on the part of the reader, a great deal of contemplation. It's not a book you can pick up and skim through. It's not a book you can read once and think that you've understood it. You have to read this not even paragraph by paragraph, but sentence by sentence. And you'll find yourself over and over going back and trying to, really figure out what is it that he's saying, because the book is indeed so profound. I'll read another. In his introduction, he says, as to what follows, amma ba'd, I have taken up these pages and written on them about poverty and whatever is related to the subject of poverty, not for the purpose of eradicating it, but so that it may be endured patiently, and not to study it, but in order to console those it has afflicted. I have furthermore written about wealth and what is related to it, not out of any desire to spoil it for those who possess it, but in order to rectify the misconceptions of others. In all of this, I have directed my discourse in the fashion of a poet, regarding the jocundity of nature and its buoyancy, rather than in the mode of a philosopher, acknowledging the moroseness of matter and its dispassion. In doing so, I have tended in the direction of reasoned order to disseminate for the soul what comes to mind concerning poverty, for it is the soul in its purlieu that I intend to address. Moreover, I have approached this from the glint of daybreak and not from the gloom of night, and from the horizons of faith and not the puddles of doubt. With it, I intend to explain something of God's wisdom in matters, often misunderstood by humankind. Indeed, among the failings and frailties of humans is that they continue to assume God's bounty, God's mercy, and God's limitless care, but in the way that a peacock assumes its colors, its features, and its singular beauty on two bare legs so ugly that they could belong to a crow. Human nature. This is what he's talking us about. I'm going to move a little bit. I chose this book because it deals with questions that all of us understand, all of us confront almost daily in our lives. Wealth, poverty, religion. We're all concerned with each one of these subjects. But most of us are confused about, where they stand and where we stand with regard to these things. Some of us think that the height of religious piety, the height of virtue in religion, is to be poor. The man on the hill, the yogi, the Sufi, cut off from the rest of the world, the monk, the nun, who have, worshiping God in their own way in some mountain monastery or in some Hanukkah. That's a common belief about poverty, that it's a good thing. And indeed, it can be a good thing. But it needs to be understood as a means to something good, not that it is in and of itself to be desired. It's only a means. And the means can vary from person to person, from time to time. The means for me at age 17 to achieve something may have been one set of things. The means for me to achieve that at my present age could be completely different. So all of these things have to be taken into consideration. Unfortunately, we don't go that far with our thought. Al-Rafi'i will help us. Western academia and Western classical thought has always had this dichotomy between, the royalty and the privileged classes, and then everyone else was, the divine right of kings. The royals deserved to be royal because God chose for them to be royal. Well, likewise with regard to the wealthy in Western society class from Greek times up till now. It was understood that those who were privileged, those who were at the top of society, the elites, well, they deserved to be wealthy. And the converse was true too. Those who were not royal, or those who were not elites, deserved to be poor. And no one thought anything about it. In fact, if those people dared to try and better their situation through commerce or whatever, then, this was looked down upon even by the thinkers of Western thought, until maybe the last couple of centuries. There are books written on the subject of capitalism and how it has developed over the centuries. And the interesting thing about it is that it's only recently that commerce and trade has actually been considered reputable, something decent, the kind of occupation that decent people undertake. Otherwise, it was left for, the riffraff. Let them be the traders. Let them be the shopkeepers. The thinkers, the elites, the wealthy. They wouldn't, they wouldn't dirty their hands with that sort of stuff, right? So we have these built-in attitudes, or different societies have built-in attitudes about wealth and poverty and how it comes about and how it should be treated. Islam is no different. Or let's put it this way: Muslims are no different. We too have our different kinds of thinking about wealth and poverty, and it's important that we re-examine these things and really look at them closely. Rafi will help us do that. I'll talk about my own experience, but I'll change that. The narrator. This book is narrated by one Shaykh Ali. Shaykh Ali comes to us early on in the book, and he tells us stories. Through Shaykh Ali, al-Rafi'i is getting us to think. He's engaging us. This is not a departure in Arabic literature. In fact, it's a part of a long-established tradition. The maqamat literature. Maqam, as you know, is qiyam, and qama yaqumu is to stand. In the old days, the orator would stand up and speak. People would listen around him. So the maqamat literature was developed from this tradition of oration and oral narration. Shaykh Ali is the narrator in this particular book. Usually in the maqamat literature you find that it was designed to entertain as well as to edify. But the entertainment part was important, very important. And so most of the narrators in maqamat literature were tricksters and shysters and people who would add a little special color to the stories that were being told. So Abu Zayd al-Saruji from Maqamat al-Hariri and so on. And there are a number of classical Maqamat narrators. Here, however, in this book, the author's aim was in having Shaykh Ali narrate the book, is that Shaykh Ali is himself an example of the destitute, a person who is completely cut off from the world. He's a person who doesn't get it in the sense that he lives his own life unaffected by the sorts of things that affect the rest of people in society around him. And so he becomes the ideal narrator for the ideas that a Rafi'i wants to convey. How did I get to the text? All right. One of the things that grabbed me when I first encountered this book was the language itself, the Arabic language. I mentioned earlier that al-Rafi'i was essentially a poet, but he, there's an interesting thing about him. At an early age, he was afflicted with some sort of a disease that rendered him deaf. So he couldn't attend school with his companions, with his peers. Instead, he became self-taught. I said he came from a tradition of learning Sharia judges. And so his father was in possession of a huge library. And Mustafa every day would go into his father's library and just sort of putter around with the books. Somehow, this fellow who was deprived of the sense of hearing developed this incredible sense of rhythm and music from the language that he was reading. Now, of course, Arabic in itself is one of those, special kinds of languages that, that has this it's so vivid and full of life. But he especially picked up on this at an early age and was able then to convey it in his poetry. He was also obviously from a religious family and was very much concerned with questions dealing with Islam and its impact on society. And so he authored a number of books on subjects related to Islam. He wrote a book about the i'jaz of the Quran, which is essentially the inimitability of the Quran. The Quran challenges anyone to come up with a single verse, the like of a verse written by the Almighty. He wrote on that subject a huge treatise. He also wrote on the subject of the ahadith of the Prophet, alayhi salatu wasalam. And he contributed, I think on a monthly basis, articles to different magazines and publications in the country. But to get back to the text, so what I'm saying is that he was a practiced, not only poet, but, let's say he was a natural poet, but he was also a practiced writer of prose and a man of ideas. And so he used all of those abilities to write the book that we see today in front of us, The Destitute. It was quite a challenge. It's a challenge to translate anything from any language. Let's be quite frank about that. I mean, translation, as I said earlier, is an art. It's very, very difficult to be true to the original when you're translating. Translating is essentially not it's more than just conveying meaning from one language into another. It's conveying meaning in a context, and it's giving form to that meaning, such that the reader in the target language is able to move along with the flow. Translations which are done poorly, or translations which follow sort of, the literal word-for-word kind of translations, are almost, in any situation, incomprehensible. They just don't work. And so that's the fundamental difficulty in translating. Translating from Arabic to English is especially difficult because of one's going to the left and one's going to the right, obvious reasons. But aside from all of that, there's so much in the Arabic literary tradition which English simply doesn't have, and vice versa. I mean, every language has its own special sauce, its own special colorings. But Arabic in particular, and especially given the centuries and centuries of literary tradition in Arabic. And so here's my disclaimer. I have definitely, I confess, I have taken liberties with the text. You can call it editorial license, or you can call it foolishness. But my idea was to give life to the meaning behind the words. And I'll tell you why I feel I can do that. See, I have an imaginary friend, okay? When I was a kid, I didn't really, not really. But now that I'm, grown a little bit older, I have imaginary friends. My imaginary friends are figures from literature. Some of them are actually the authors of that literature. And when you spend weeks, months, hours every day with an author and with his work or her work, you begin to, imagine, anyway, that you have a relationship with that person. Abu Hamid over coffee. I was having coffee in Dubai a few months ago, about a year and a half ago, with a student who had come to me to discuss something about his career. Anyway, we got on to whatever the subject was, and I said, yeah, Abu Hamid made a comment like that. And he said to me, it was completely out of the blue, he said, Abu Hamid, who's he? Is that my boss? No, we were talking about my boss. No, I mean Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, because I've been translating al-Ghazali for years, so Abu Hamid's comments to me are like, somebody standing on my shoulder and saying, Yusuf, this is what the situation is. So, that's kind of a funny wake-up call to me. I realized, Yusuf, you better get a grip. But that happens. When you're translating, so I feel as if, when I talk about, my editorial license and I apologize and I have a disclaimer, I feel, well, maybe I do have some kind of a right, not a right, but, bear with me, folks, If the author, were my contemporary and we lived in the same society, it wouldn't be so difficult. But, even, he lived 100 years, he died in 1937, I believe, something like that. So he lived, in the last century, and he lived in Egypt. I lived in Egypt for a few years, but not very long, not long enough to really understand the context that he was writing in. Nonetheless, you have to take a leap of faith in any sort of kind of translation. But the interesting thing about translation is that every once in a while, as a translator, you come across a passage, things are going nicely and you're moving right along, and then you hit a passage that just whacks you in the head, and you say, oh my goodness, what am I going to do with this? I'm supposed to be, I know this language, I know this terminology, I know this writer. What is he trying to say to me, all of a sudden? And then you work at it, and you work at it, and you work at it. And the funny thing about it is that, after when you come back and review your work, and you review it over and over again, obviously, but you come back to review your work, you discover that these passages, the ones that you thought were giving you so much trouble in the beginning, you discover that they've come out great. Oh, wow, this is beautiful. Gee, Yusuf, did you do that? Or I'm going to talk to Abu Hamid. Yeah, Abu Hamid, what do you think about that? Right? Because I guess, you expend the effort on polishing these things up, and they shine the most. So, I surprised myself several times with the text in this book. Arabic language, Arabic literature will often use literary conceits that are based upon the grammar of the language. So you have, all of you know, the jar and majroor of the Arabic language, right? Al-jarru wal-majroor. So but it's impossible for me for anyone to, because the language, the grammar of every language is different. So it's nearly impossible to translate it literally, right? So you have to do things like this. When he beheld that she had achieved the ultimate in adorning and beautifying herself, he sought to become a preposition to her noun, so that the two might be linked as one. It's jar and majroor in the Arabic. I used a noun and a preposition, but I think the idea comes across.
Are you pitching this as a romantic book?
Oh, there's everything in this. Absolutely. Here's more romance, but it's hardly romance. It's tragedy, actually. Those of you who know the Arabic language are familiar with the Hamza. The Hamza is written in Arabic like a two, backwards, okay? Or in the mirror, a mirror vision image of a two. And so the passage is, how many maidens, and of course the alif is the one that's straight up and down, thin. How many maidens, as slender and straight as an alif, have been given to codgers, as twisted and bent as a Hamza? Old men, married off to old men, young women. And I explain that by saying that the letter in Arabic that is written like a backwards two, the letter Hamza, rather. But what you can't write in there is that the Hamza is essentially a glottal stop. Iqra, right? The glottal stop. And what about the glottal stop? What are its characteristics? It sounds like wheezing and choking, right? So that's something that you could never translate. Harf taswif, again, is a harf taswif. While to him, she was the future. Oh, he saw his future in her. But what did she see in him? He remained to her the present that had to be put off. There's no possible way that I could convey to you just how amazing I find this book to be. Because indeed, it is an incredible book. Mustafa Sadiq al-Rafi'i was one of the really shining stars of the Egyptian literary firmament. And yet, today, Mustafa Sadiq al-Rafi'i is barely known, even to his own countrymen. When I undertook this project, I wrote to a number of Egyptian universities, to their departments of literature, requesting information as to whether or not they knew of translations of Rafi'i's work. I wondered, has anyone else translated his work? I didn't want to do something that someone else had done. And likewise, he'd written a great deal of literature, so I wanted to know if perhaps someone else had sort of set a standard, a bar that I could aspire to. And unfortunately, no one responded. In fact, I thought it incredible. I'm writing to them about this great author, this wonderful poet, and yet they're not even bothered to respond. What's going on? And I guess that's just the way it is. Unfortunately, it may be for political reasons, it may be otherwise, but it sometimes happens that great people and great works get overlooked. It appears, however, that his work continues to be taught in some places, in some of the faculties at al-Azhar, for example. But al-Rafi'i is probably best known for a series of essays that he wrote on the subject of the Quran, in defense of the Quran. He calls it, he actually collected his essays, or his students collected his essays on the subject and published them in a single volume under the title Tahta Rayat al-Quran, or Beneath the Banner of the Quran, in which essentially al-Rafi'i attempts to defend the Quran from those who attempted to detract from its literary value, its authenticity, its standing. I mean, people who were just completely, tried to destroy the Quran for whatever reasons they had. And that book has been published and republished around the Arab world. And so if al-Rafi'i is known for anything, it's for that particular set of essays. But as I said, throughout his career, he continued to write and publish in journals and even in newspapers, and on various subjects related to Islam and to the literature, Arabic literature. In fact, when it was announced in the 1920s, early 1920s, that I guess there was only one university at that time in Egypt. So they announced that they were going to teach, they were going to institute there a faculty of Arabic literature. So he got in touch with the authorities of the university and asked them what sort of curricula they intended to offer to the students and whether or not they had textbooks. And the answer he got was that, well, we don't have any textbooks. So he suggested to them, why not have a competition? Invite, this is such a wealthy country in terms of literature, why not invite the contemporary writers and professors of language to write textbook for Arabic literature. And so they agreed. In the end, there were two entrants, only two. One was the Tarikh al-Adab al-Arabi by Georgi Zaidan, and the other one was al-Rafi'i's Tarikh al-Adab al-Arabi. Georgi Zaidan won the competition, even though anyone was even close, I mean, anyone with even a passing sort of acquaintance with the subject would look at the two works and know immediately which was the more profound, which was the better. And yet, his entry was rejected, and Georgi Zaidan won the prize. It was probably a few pounds. But in any case, it brought to the world another masterpiece from Mustafa Sadiq al-Rafi'i, and that is the 3 or 5 volume work that he produced for this competition about the history of the Arabic language, which is quite wonderful. Let me finish up with this one. I'll just read this last passage and then I'll let you go. He writes, "Fie on this worldly life. Those who love it fear what's in it. And when they fear what's in it, they fear everything about it. They are miserable with it and miserable because of it. Such people, when they contemplate a disaster from among any of destiny's disaster, will imagine that wretchedness has turned its back on the rest of humanity to confront them and them alone." Such was Rafi'i's feeling about the situation of people with regard to wealth and poverty. Essentially, his message to us is that it's all in our heads, and it's all an illusion. Allah is al-Razaq for a reason, and that reason is that Allah will provide. The Almighty will provide. Regardless of our stupidity, we can make incorrect decision after incorrect decision, and yet He, out of His mercy, continues to provide for us. So Allahul Razaq. All of this other stuff, when we worry about our investments, we worry about our wealth, we worry about paying the bills, and it's legitimate, no doubt. And we have to take care of those affairs. We can't let them go. Those are our responsibility. We do what we can to the best of our ability. And if we're successful at it, then mashallah, that's His will. On the other hand, if we're not, it doesn't mean that we should jump out of the window. The stock market crashed. Oh, gee, let me jump out of the nearest window. That's not the way to live your life. You have to live your life satisfied, right? Satisfaction with what He provides is the greatest of gifts, right? And poverty is the lack of that satisfaction. Thank you very much.